Hailing from the Dead Marshes, Spectres are one of my favourite profiles in the game of SBG, and I love filling out my front ranks of my Angmar force with them. The 3 Spectre miniatures that Games Workshop produced represent the 3 factions in the Battle of the Last Alliance: the Second Age Elves, Númenórean Men, and Sauron's Orcs. But with the Dead Marshes located here, and Angmar being all the way up here, I'm not sure if they fully match the aesthetic of my Angmar force. I have the 3 poses, and if I want to field more than 3, I usually proxy some Twilight Ringwraiths. But recently, I felt the need to kitbash my own together. I'm Joe from Windrush Wargamers, and here's how I made my Angmar Spectre conversions. For my first conversion, I wanted a new race. We have elves, men and orcs, so I wanted to add in my favourite race, dwarves. But I felt that it was important for this to be some kind of wandering dwarf, perhaps a merchant that had wandered over the Misty Mountains and died before being raised by the Witch King to serve in the ranks of Angmar, rather than a rank and file Dwarf Warrior. I first started at the legs. The Dwarf Warrior kits of Erebor and Khazad-dûm are all unique, so offer some good choices. I chose this one though, a 2-handed axeman from Khazad-dûm. I'd used this previously to practice painting tartan. The legs of this miniature fit with the merchant vibe, as he was quite lightly armoured in his bottom half, with just little chainmail underneath the tunic. I began by sawing through at the waist, ensuring to leave the axe and the bag on his hip. Next, I needed to find a torso to match the legs. I wanted a tunic or a gambeson, as a breastplate would feel too militaristic. I found one in the most unlikely places, a plastic Legolas. This slender elf torso was easily cut down and able to fit on the legs beside the pouch and the axe. Now, working up from the torso, I needed a head for this dwarf, more specifically a huge beard. This I found on another Khazad-dûm Dwarf Warrior. I had to saw this beard off vertically. I was careful to make it as thin as possible without obscuring any of the detail. Next, I separated the top of the head and removed the helmet. This is to make it look a little bit more like a civilian. Then, the beard was glued in place onto the body. For the left arm, I elected to use this plastic Gimli kit, as sections of the chainmail could be seen poking through his armour. I sliced off at the arm and removed the axe before gluing it in place. I liked the left arm, but for the right arm I wanted to return to a more lightly armoured look, and also bring in some more of the undead themes. For this, I used the MVP kit of this kit bash, the Fireforge Games Living Dead Knight set. I'd previously used the horses from this kit for my Riders of the Dead conversions, but the kit leaves a lot of extra bits that are perfect for undead conversions like these Spectres. So I clipped off a right arm holding a sword and trimmed it down at the elbow. This was to give him a shorter arm, perfect for a dwarf. Also, it made mounting it into the arm socket easier. The shoulder for this right arm was going to be a tattered sleeve from a Warrior of the Dead. Keeping with the undead theme here, I used the top of a skull from a Citadel skull set to act as a head. The final piece of this conversion was to cover up the back. The removal of the quiver from the plastic Legolas kit had left a really nasty flat surface that needed to be covered. I decided to cover this up with a travelling backpack from the Dwarven Reclaimers set from Unreleased Miniatures. But I didn't want to cut up another miniature, so I press moulded a copy of it. I placed this blue stuff into boiling water until it came out soft and pliable. Then I simply pressed the backpack into the blue stuff and allowed it to cool. When it was fully cool, I could pop the miniature out of the mould and apply a 1-to-1 mixture of green stuff and milliput. This mixture took roughly 1 day to dry, and when it was dry I was able to pop it out of the mould and trim away any unwanted parts like this hood here, before gluing it onto the back of the dwarf. In terms of actual sculpting, I had very little to do on this miniature. A Aside from the odd gap filling, I only had to sculpt the left sleeve and some hair. My next conversion would be my simplest, a Ranger of the North that had fallen foul of the Witch King's magic. The base for this conversion was not a Ranger of the North as I didn't have any spare, but instead I used a plastic Ranger of Middle-earth. After stripping the paint, I removed the arrows and broke the bow with my clippers. This was to hint at his past as a Ranger without giving him the ability to actually shoot arrows because Spectres can't do that in game. For the head, I used a spare helmeted head from the Warrior of the Dead kit. This meant I could kill two birds with one stone, as I could add a zombified head, and also, the helmet is reminiscent of ones worn by Rangers of the North. Utilising the Living Dead Knights kit again, I snipped off an arm just above the elbow, and was able to replace the Ranger's left arm with it. I then had to trim down the cape so I could attach a sword arm. The sword arm was facing down, so it looked like he was dragging the blade along the ground. The green stuff work was fairly simple on this one, just filling in gaps and adding subtle bits of texture. My last conversion is this Lord of Cairn Doom. Now Cairn Doom is one of the regions of Angmar populated by mankind, which falls under the dark powers of the Witch King. I wanted this conversion to seem like it came from an ancient and unique culture, one which we hadn't really explored in the miniatures range. For this, I wanted the clothing to seem expensive and any armour to be purely ceremonial in nature. This will help sell the idea that he was quite high up in the nobility. I started with some spare legs from a Warrior of the Dead. This would give the miniature some nicely tattered robes, as well as a small amount of armour. The torso for this lord was from an Orc Warrior of all places. I like the fur around the neck. This could be some forage critter for the Orc, but here I think it could represent a nicer, more upmarket pelt. The body was then glued down to the legs. I wasn't really worried about it fitting exactly, because I knew I'd be coming back in with green stuff to blend it. The head of the lord was also provided by an Orc Warrior, although a different one. One modification I did make off camera was to slice off the nose with my Stanley knife. This made the profile of the face a lot more Skeletor in nature. Onto the Lord's arms. I had a spare Morgul Knight arm for his right arm, but I wanted to make the left side match, particularly on the shoulder pad area. To achieve this, I just press moulded it in the same way that I press moulded the Dwarf's backpack. The Living Dead's Knight kit was again used for the weapon here, but unlike the other conversions, I decided to use a sword still in its sheath. All I had to do was pin it in place at the hip. With the left arm done, I still needed a hand for my right arm. I decided to use this gloved hand from the Warg Riders, and I pinned it in place onto the Morgul Knight's arm. Despite being made up predominantly of Orc pieces, I think they marry together quite well and they're able to give off the appearance of a wealthy human. After the initial filling of gaps, the sculpting on this piece was to blend the robe, hair and fur into the torso and make it look like one solid piece. The painting of these miniatures was pretty simple. Blue-grey for the skin tone, just like the GW miniatures. Worn fabric effects were added via stippling, and all the metal was rusted and patinaed to make it look really worn and also very damp. After the conversions were done, I moved on to the bases. I wanted it to make it appear as if the Spectres were crawling out of some frozen lake in the icy north. I started by ripping off sections of cork. This is a cork drink coaster from IKEA, they're really cheap. These were glued down to some 28mm bases. They gave some height and allowed me to add some water effects in later. The next step was to blend this all together, so I added texture paint all over the ground coverage. This is Stirland Battlemire from Games Workshop. This gives a cold, dark, gloopy mud effect. For the water effects, I used Griff Charger Grey contrast paint mixed with a product called Aqua Magic. The blue-grey here does significantly fade when it's dry, but it does give a subtle hint of coldness to the water. Aqua Magic shrinks when it dries, so this may take several layers. I think the finished product had about 3 layers on it. Next step was to add some grass tufts and some fallen leaf debris, before covering the base in another GW texture paint, Valhallan Blizzard, for the snow effect. To make it appear as if the miniatures have been crawling out of the mud, Stirland Battlemire and Valhallan Blizzard were added to the legs of each of the conversions. Overall, I'm really pleased with how these turned out. I think they blend in quite nicely with the original sculpts. Here are their conversions in all their glory. I'm going to take this opportunity to talk about why I love the Dead Marsh Spectre profile so much. At Fight 2, with a points value of 15, that's quite steep. I'd kind of overlooked these in the past. I would maybe take 1 or 2, just to kind of have the Fellight is within them special rule. This allows me to move their miniatures if they fail a courage check within 12 inches. But I realised quite recently that I was overlooking a great deal of what makes the Dead Marsh Spectre profile amazing. The defense 5 means that you don't lose anything from an Orc Warrior with shield. At courage 6 they have the best courage of any troop for the Angmar force. This means that they're more than likely able to overcome terrifying situations, and they're going to stick around at the end of the game. Lastly, you'd be forgiven for thinking that strength 3 would mean that they're pretty average when they hit, but because of the Blade of the Dead special rule, they're hitting on other people's courage, that means that particularly against evil armies they punch well above their weight. I don't play competitively very often, so take my advice with a pinch of salt, but I really love playing with Dead Marsh Spectres, and now I have 6 of them to play with. That about wraps things up for this video. Thank you so much for watching. We've got loads of other Middle-earth content, so do yourself a favour. Click some of the videos on the screen now. Subscribe for more content. I've been Joe. This is Windrush Wargamers. Thanks so much. Catch you in the next one. Bye bye.